sometimes nostalgia isn't actually just nostalgia. It's fair to say that when you look at the new copy and paste Ubisoft open world game demanding a mortgage from you, we used to often have it a lot better when it comes to our video games. Everything old is new again is also a mantra that's kept gaming alive over the years. Need a game release to hit a certain window or quarter, or your development team feels like they could nail it properly on the second go around. Get to work on a remake. It's a strategy that's worked very well for studios like Capcom, who arguably improved the classic Resident Evil 1 and 2 with their remakes, and recently Resident Evil 4 in 2023. There are even some lunatics out there who think they also improved Resident Evil 3, like my fellow Vulture Ash, but please don't enable his nonsense. Anyway, the Resident Evil games aren't the only PS1 treasures in that library deserving of a remake. With hundreds of classic, iconic games, you've got the pick of the litter when it comes to choosing a potential remake from the OG PlayStation. With that in mind, we've narrowed it down to a list of 10 PS1 games that actually do need a remake for one reason or another. 1. Dino Crisis. Quick, someone pressed the YouTube channel wanting a Dino Crisis remake button. We got another one. The absolute most obvious choice, and the one that appears on every single list of this type. There's a reason why people keep asking for a remake of Dino Crisis, and it's because Capcom has knocked it out of the park consistently with their work on Resident Evil's remakes. If they can work the magic again on a series that's essentially just more Resident Evil but with dinosaurs instead of zombies, you're looking at another million seller for the Japanese publisher. It feels like all the pieces are in place for a Dino Crisis revival, as Capcom has achieved unparalleled levels of success redoing their old library of horror games. Meanwhile, Exoprimal saw Capcom experimenting with dinosaur shooters, albeit with players controlling mechs in a 5v5 PvE multiplayer game, but still. If there ever was a time for Capcom to remake the original Dino Crisis, it'd be right now, and we're definitely not the only ones who would be incredibly excited for it to happen. Meanwhile, has anyone played Exoprimal lately? Let's just check in quickly with it and see how it's... Oh dear. That's looking kind of extinct, isn't it? Jeez. Number 2, Vagrant Story. Vagrant Story isn't the most obscure RPG on the PS1, but it's also not the most popular either, receiving less love than games like Chrono Cross and Final Fantasy VII. Occupying that space where a remake could give it the audience it truly deserves, Vagrant Story is actually a perfect candidate for a PS1 game remake. There are more than enough fans around who are yearning for a chance to play the game without having to dig the emulators out, while allowing enough opportunity for the game to reach a whole new audience. Playing as a risk breaker called Ashley. Oh, hold on, Ash has left a note here on the script. 1 second. Hey Jimmy, please let the viewers know that Ashley is a very strong, very masculine, very strong name, and it should never be confused with a girl. Huh, weird. Anyway, you've pursued a cult leader by the name of Sydney to the town of Leamonde. Sydney has gone to ground, hiding out in the ruined city's catacombs, so you'll need to explore and defeat any enemies you find, crafting and upgrading weapons along the way. While it might be difficult to achieve given Vagrant Story's real-time combat, an Octopath Traveler-esque visual upgrade could be a good remake path to explore here. And God knows Square Enix could do with a bit of an easy win with their fans these days. Number 3, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. Legend and mythology would have you believe that vampires are immortal, which is clearly a lot of baloney. I'm gonna go with it. Which is clearly a lot of baloney, considering the Legacy of Kain is about as dead as it gets at this point. Despite still being considered one of the most beloved franchises ever created, it feels like we're never getting a new Legacy of Kain game at this point, meaning the last game in the series is that somewhat stinky multiplayer release, Nosgoth. That can't be the lasting legacy, the final epitaph of this weird, engaging gothic horror opera. Clearly, a new game in the series is much needed, and while an original release would certainly be appreciated by the core fanbase, it feels like a remake of the most successful game, Soul Reaver, would be the correct move. While still a fun, engaging action platformer with what kids call big aura, Soul Reaver's slightly repetitive gameplay and wibbly wobbly graphics could do with a huge overhaul, and if it helped drum up interest in a brand new game in this iconic series, even better. However, considering that Embracer owns Legacy of Kain, and considering that Embracer is currently a bit of a garbage fire filled with tyres and unsold copies of AEW Fight Forever, let's not hold our breath, guys. Number 4. Parasite Eve. Another one of Square's unsung PS1 whippers, Parasite Eve saw a largely RPG focused team trying to create a survival horror experience in the same vein of Resident Evil or Silent Hill. The end result was a game that looks precisely like it was cut from the same horror cloth, but the gameplay is more in line with the most ridiculous RPG systems you could think of. Taking control of an NYPD rookie by the name of Aya Brea, you find yourself in the centre of what can only be described as weird body horror shenanigans. People are either spontaneously combusting, mutating, or becoming one with a big orange blob of slime. Delicious. The gameplay is certainly not to everyone's taste, as you need to avoid attacks and wait for your bar to fill up before you can fire, but those who enjoy Parasite Eve's implementation of the active time bar in a horror shooter will find an experience unlike any other. If Square were to remake it though, they should just keep it as it is, albeit with a new coat of paint. That gameplay system is too weird to just turn into another third-person shooter like the Resident Evil 2 remake. Looking at you, alone in the dark. Also, the original Parasite Eve never even came out in Europe. Square Enix hates Portugal confirmed. Number 5. Twisted Metal. There's never been a better time for a Twisted Metal revival, and yes, we're just saying that based on the fact it's become a fairly successful TV show. Strike while the iron is relatively hot or kind of warm, right? That's how it goes. Twisted Metal's particular brand of car combat was a core part of the original PS1 and PS2 era of Sony games, but aside from a PS3 revival that failed to set the world on fire, the franchise was mostly dead in the water until the TV adaptation. Turns out, all you need to reinvigorate a dead game franchise is Anthony Mackie, Stephanie Beatriz, and Samoa Joe. It's mainly because of Samoa Joe, let's be real. He would make a pretty good hurdy-gurdy bear though. Anyway, as for how Sony would approach a remake of the Twisted Metal franchise, it'd be good to tie it into the world of the TV show. Bring the actors from the show in, get them to record some lines while retaining the simple and enjoyable gameplay of the original games, and so long as the game is priced appropriately, it should be a good laugh at the very least. If nothing else, it'd be a decent shake-up of Sony's exclusives, and would probably be more successful than Destruction All-Stars 2. Not hard, like. Remember that? Destruction All-Stars? Anyone? Anyone at all? Hello. Number 6, Final Fantasy 8 or 9. Look, we can't decide on this one, so we're going to leave it up to you guys. While Final Fantasy VII was obviously the breakout hit for the Final Fantasy series on PS1, fans love the follow-up games 8 and 9 almost just as much, well, maybe not so much for 8. As games, both Final Fantasy 8 and 9 couldn't be more different, with 8 adopting a more sci-fi world and story with plenty of brooding characters and edge, while 9 is a more endearing medieval fantasy that's got a lot of heart. Remaking both games is certainly possible, but it'd require a different touch for each one. Final Fantasy VIII would probably be an easier remake, considering the game is filled with the same kind of lovable twinks that Final Fantasy VII also boasts. It's just that Squall happens to be cooler because his sword also has gun. Have it follow the same path as the Final Fantasy VII remakes, but without the alternate universe / timeline bollocks please, and it'll be pretty good. As for Final Fantasy IX, its chibi-esque characters means we'll probably get something akin to the Super Mario RPG remake. Some new visuals, a couple of gameplay improvements, and not much else. Final Fantasy IX is still fantastic though, so you can't complain. Listen, Monkey Tail and Jump Rope in 4K, you've charmed us, Square. Number 7, Xenogears. Yes, it's another PS1 RPG, but to be fair to us, the RPG genre is probably the most successful and prolific genre for the PS1, behind maybe the platformer. People loved playing RPGs on their little grey console, and a lot of those RPGs are still worth checking out, such as Xenogears. A game from a creator ahead of their time, it would take Tetsuya Takahashi founding Monolith Soft for his work to truly become appreciated. But his last work at Square, Xenogears, could definitely do with a second look. An ambitious game, and one that ultimately crumbled under its own weight, Xenogears is perhaps most famous for the fact that the back half of the story basically turns into a visual novel with occasional gameplay interludes. Critics still loved the story and gameplay at the time, or whatever they could actually follow of it at least, but that unfinished second part has become a huge gaming what if at this point. How a remake for Xenogears could come about these days is unclear, given Square Enix owns Xenogears and Monolith Soft is a Nintendo studio, but if Square and Monolith managed to find a way to let Takahashi and the gang have a second go, this would be a perfect remake choice. Number 8. Ape Escape. So Ash helped me to write this, but in his script he's just written "alright" and "no ape makes Ash a dull boy" like 50 times. The boy is bananas for these games. If the general success of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart for the PS5 should have proved anything to Sony, is that people still bloody love 3D action platformers. Ape Escape is also a 3D action platformer, but even though Sony would love to consider the iconic mischievous ape as one of PlayStation's iconic mascots, we haven't had a proper Ape Escape game in years. That needs to change, stat, and a remake would go a long way in that regard. We can't let this be the final newish thing from the IP. We just can't, okay? We just can't. A silly yet utterly wonderful experience, Ape Escape is exactly as it says on the tin. A bunch of apes have broken loose, and so you need to go round them up. The original game in the series saw players travelling through time, leading to plenty of unique levels, and while it was remade for the PSP in 2005, a full upgrade would be very much neato. Heck, even just the 4K reskin of all 3 mainline games bundled together like Wipeout and Mega Collection would be very much appreciated. Number 9. Driver. Now, are we advocating for a remake of a specific PS1 game because the tutorial level is too hard and we'd like to actually see the rest of the game one day? Maybe we are, and while that might lead to some snarky comments, you try playing the opening level to Driver today and see how far you get. It's like being asked to milk a crocodile, it just doesn't make any sense! A remake for this iconic series, with perhaps a remake of Driver 2 thrown in for good measure, would certainly go down a treat. As the name implies, you spend your time in Driver behind the wheel, with the majority of the game's missions seeing you act as an undercover getaway driver, dodging criminals, police, and everyone in between in a race to your objective. Or we, think that's what the game's about. Does anyone know? For all we know, you could actually have to milk a crocodile. Again, that opening level is really, really hard. Like, the rest of Driver is pretty good. Allegedly. Well, it's almost certainly better than Driver 3, or Driv for. At the very least, there's already precedent for a driving level in a remake being nerfed because it's too hard. So let's have Driver follow the Mafia example, please and thank you. And number 10, Siphon Filter. Though the majority of gamers today seem to favour the all guns blazing method of playing video games, there's just not enough stealth action games on the market right now. Back in the day, you couldn't beat up your brother on top of a giant robot T-Rex without seeing a PlayStation stealth game, including the likes of Metal Gear Solid, Splinter Cell and Sly Cooper. But there was another series that hasn't survived, Ben Studios' Siphon Filter. Despite nigh universal acclaim, a lot of which is for letting you taser dudes until they go on fire, because that's f***ing metal. And a PSP revival that is still well loved, Siphon Filter hasn't been seen in years apart from a couple of recent ports. Perhaps a remake would be the perfect remedy. Truthfully, with 3 games in the Siphon Filter series all available on PS1, Sony and Bend Studio would do well to release a fully, properly upgraded collection of all these classics. Sure, some of them are available on PlayStation Plus for the most expensive tier users, but an overhauled version of all 3 games with modern gameplay and improved graphics would be a great way to honour the legacy of a series that died way before its time. Will it ever happen? Probably not, but we'd still love to see it. Survival horror has had its second chance in the sun, now it's time for the sneaky boys. And hey, Sony, while we're here and while you're obviously watching this intently, because this is how you get all your ideas, let Bend Studio return to Days Gone while you're at it. Make another Days Gone game, that was great. And that was our list going over some of the PS1 games that we think deserve a remake. What do you think deserves a remake? Let us know down in the comments, down below. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.